Chapter 4. The men awakened simultaneously from their second plunge into this mysterious anesthesia. The circumstances under which they found themselves were even more baffling and more incredible than their confused senses could at first comprehend. It was evident at once that they were no longer on the ether ship, for the room in which they were lying was very spacious, and was walled and roofed and floored with an alabaster-like stone of great lustre and beauty. There were many open windows of an oval form, through which bewildering glimpses of an intricate alien architecture were visible against a violet sky. The impression conveyed was that they were in an upper story of some lofty edifice. The air was pervaded with a tropic warmth. They were lying on a broad couch, covered with a flossy, mottled material of red and saffron, and inclined at an angle of perhaps 15 degrees. The room was furnished with several small tables, supported on frail, spidery legs, and littered with outlandish implements and quaintly shaped phials, such as the surgeons or chemists of an unknown world might employ. Except for Volmar and Roverton, the room was seemingly untenanted. More curious even than their surroundings, however, were the sensations of the two men. Contrary to all natural expectation, there was no least trace of illness, hunger, thirst, or fatigue on the part of either. Also, with the feeling that amounted to stupefaction, both realized that they were breathing a pure, well-oxygenated air, and that they were wearing their masks, which must have been replaced during their period of unconsciousness. It seemed as if the air supply in the tanks must in some unaccountable manner have been renewed by their captors. Both men were conscious of a singular buoyancy, a remarkable alertness, and bodily well-being. "Are you all right?" asked Volmar, as he sat up on the couch and turned to Roverton. "Never better in my life. But I can't understand why I should feel that way. The last I can remember is being deadly sick in that infernal menagerie cage. And where are we, anyway? It certainly looks as if we had arrived somewhere." "I judge," answered Volmar, "that we are on the particular planetary body to which our captors belong. Plainly, when they found us with our masks off, they realized that we were intelligent beings like themselves, and not mere monsters, and they have been treating us since with more consideration. They must have analyzed the remaining air in our tanks, and then replenished it with a synthetic substitute of their own. What else they've done to us, I don't know, but probably we'll find out before long." "Speaking for myself," said Roverton, "I feel as if I had been well dined and wined, and had received a shot in the arm to boot. They must have found some way to feed us while we were unconscious, and something non-poisonous and assimilable by the human organism to feed us with." "Truly," admitted Volmar, "it is a remarkable situation. I don't know how it will all end, but we are lucky to be alive under the circumstances, and no doubt there are some even more extraordinary experiences in store for us." "I don't care how extraordinary they are," returned Roverton. "I'd rather be back on board the Alcyone. What do you suppose Jasper and Deming and the rest are doing anyway? There isn't one chance in a billion that they could follow us or find out what has happened to us. Probably they're combing that damned Mercurian planet in an effort to discover what has swallowed us up. They may have seen the departure of the strange ether ship. Whether or not it would occur to them that we are on board is another matter. And even if they did figure this out, it would be a miracle if they could have done it quickly enough to follow the alien flyer, keep it in sight, and locate its destination." Before Roverton could reply, he and Volmar saw that 3 dwarfs were standing beside them. These beings were taller, with a more authoritative bearing, with more delicate antennae and proboscides than the ones they had seen on the space vessel, and their coloration partook of deep red and orange and Tyrian tones. With queer, jerky genuflections, like nodding insects, they addressed the men. Their words were scarcely articulate to human ears, but an idea of formal courtesy and obeisance was somehow conveyed. Volmar and Roverton, rising to their feet, returned the greeting in the best manner they could muster. Plucking the sleeves of the men's clothing with their antennal fingers, with elaborate gestures whose meaning was obvious, the dwarfs led the way through an odd elliptical door that had been concealed from sight in an angle of the wall. Thence, at the end of a short passage, the party emerged on a sort of balcony. The Earthmen gave an involuntary gasp of amazement and were seized by a slight dizziness as they approached the verge, for the balcony was merely a scant ledge without walls, railings, or handholds of any kind, and below, at an awful depth, were the streets of a monstrous city. It was like looking down from a precipice into some alpine chasm. All around and above there soared other buildings of the same white material and the same bizarre structure as the one on whose balcony the Earthmen were standing. These edifices were of colossal extent, and many of them culminated in airy spires and pinnacles of a fairy delicacy, thronging the bright purple heavens like a host of shining obelisks. At frequently recurring intervals, the buildings were connected by bridges of gossamer thinness and fragility, which formed a gleaming webwork in the air. They were wrought of that pale alabastrine substance, and one of them issued without sign of jointure from a narrow ledge at the Earthmen's feet, and ran to the midway story of a Titan pile that was more than 50 yards distant. The scene, in its crowding, multiform strangeness, was such as to bewilder and baffle human vision. All was incognizably foreign, a teeming babel of undreamt and baroque architectural forms. Far down in the abysmal streets, and on the lofty bridges, the frail people of the city passed like iridescent motes. All was weirdly silent, apart from certain recurrent rumblings and mutterings which seemed to come from underground, like the pulsing of hidden gigantic engineries. Spellbound by the vision, and dazed by its vistas, Volmar and Roverton became slowly aware that one of their guides had stepped from the balcony to the bridge and was signing them to follow.
"Holy smoke!" was Roverton's exclamation. "Are we supposed to walk on that?"
The railless bridge was barely a yard in width, and the drop to the street was terrific, at least a full half-mile. The guide, however, seemed to possess the equilibrium of a bird or an insect. His two companions were standing behind the Earthmen, and were armed with weapons like double-pointed goads. As Volmar and Roverton hesitated, these beings came forward, lifting the formidable points in a gesture of menace. "Well," said Volmar, "I guess we'd better move along. After all, the bridge isn't quite so bad as a tightrope." The Earthmen followed their guide, who was tripping lightly and unconcernedly before them. Accustomed though they were to cosmic elevations, they still did not care to peer downward at the dreadful gulfs on either hand, but kept their eyes on the balcony ahead. With short and careful paces, they managed to cross the long, attenuated span. It seemed to take them a long time, and they gained their goal with much relief. Looking back from their new vantage, they saw that the building they'd left was much lower than those around it, and possessed a flat, towerless roof. Several glittering vessels, similar to the one in which they had traveled through space from the Mercurian world, were lying on the edge of this roof, which was plainly a landing stage for such craft. Beyond were rows of high towers, some of which were inclined at oblique angles, and were interconnected in the same fashion as the main structures. They were now conducted into the heart of the edifice in which that precarious bridge had ended. Through labyrinthine corridors, and down slanting floors and serpentining stairs, with awkward little steps, they were led for a distance impossible to estimate. They soon passed from purple daylight to the red, unflickering glare of columnar flames that issued from black, funnel-shapen vases. The building appeared to be a sort of scientific laboratory. On every hand, in rooms of an asymmetrical construction, they saw the curious apparatus of a foreign and inconceivably advanced chemistry. People of the dwarf race were busy everywhere with arcanic tests and abstruse labors. They paid little heed to the Earthmen and were intently absorbed in the queer crucibles, vats, alembics, and other mechanisms of a less classifiable nature which they tended. At last the Earthlings and their guides entered a vast room filled with transparent cages, most of which were occupied by fearsome and variegated monsters. Among these the men recognized certain of their former companions in captivity. Some of the creatures had been rendered unconscious, and dwarfs wearing atmospheric masks had entered their cages, and by means of little suction pumps attached to crystalline vials were extracting various amounts of the life fluids, or perhaps of certain special glandular secretions, from the moveless monsters. Somewhat sickened, Volmar and Roverton watched the flowing of diverse-colored fluids into the vials as they went by.
"So that's the game," was Roverton's comment, "but I wonder what they use the stuff for."
"There's no telling. Those fluids may provide valuable serums for aught we know, or they may be used in the compounding of drugs, or even be employed as food." Passing between endless rows of cages, they reached an open space at the center of the huge apartment. Here, from floor to ceiling, there ran a great circular upright tube of the same transparent material as the cages. It was at least 8 feet in diameter. Pausing before it, the guide touched its apparently unbroken surface with his fingers, and a section of the wall swung open on almost invisible hinges, leaving a small doorway. Volmar and Roverton were motioned to enter. They obeyed with much wonder and dubiety, and the door was closed upon them. They found that they were standing on a floor of some nacreous mineral. Above them, where it met the ceiling at a height of 30 feet, the tube ended in a dull grayish disk.
"Now what?"
Roverton's voice was unnaturally loud and resonant in the closed columnar space. A number of the laboratory attendants had gathered and were standing about the tube with their fantastic faces pressed against its wall. As if in answer to Roverton's query, one of them raised his arm with a swift and sweeping gesture. It must have been a signal. Immediately, as if some hidden switch had been turned on, the Earthmen were dazzled by a ruddy light that fell upon them from above. Glancing up, they saw that the gray disk had become luminous as a great fiery jewel. Soon the radiance changed from red to green, and then from green to blue, from blue to violet, from violet to an insupportable whiteness fraught with the imminence of ultraspectral hues. Looking down through the blurs of color that clung to their vision, the men saw that the floor was glowing like molten metal and was becoming translucent beneath the weird ray. Then, all at once, they perceived an even stranger thing. Each saw that the vitrioline of his companion's suit had grown transparent, revealing every feature of head and body. Then the flesh itself grew gradually diaphanous, showing every bone and internal organ as if floating in some clear solution. Stage by stage, not with the mere shadowing of the X-ray, but with full color and minutest detail, the process went on, while the outer portions turned to a ghostly outline. Simultaneously, the men were aware of an icy sensation that seemed to pierce their very vitals inch by inch, along with the penetrating beam. They felt a strange faintness, as if they were becoming actually insubstantial. All about them seemed to waver and recede, and they saw, as from a fluctuating distance, the intent, unreadable staring of the dwarfs. The white ray was suddenly turned off, and the men resumed their normal tangibility of aspect. Both, however, were still faint and chilly from the unfamiliar force to which they had been subjected. The door was opened, and they were signaled to come forth. They tottered with a queer weakness as they stepped out into the main room. The dwarfs began to disperse till only the 3 guides remained. Volmar and Roverton, reeling with the sickness that persisted and grew upon them, were led through halls and chambers of which they were hardly half cognizant, and were thrust into a small room whose door was then closed with a gong-like clang. The room was occupied by 4 dwarfs who wore atmospheric masks, and was filled with mysterious implements that were sinister as those of a torture chamber. Here the men were directed to remove their suits and helmets. They obeyed, recovering sufficient mental clarity to realize that the air in the shut room was the same they had been breathing from their tanks. Evidently it had been prepared for their reception. Neither could remember fully afterwards the complicated and peculiar tests through which they were put during the next hour. Ill and confused and faint, they were dimly conscious of multiform instruments that were applied to their bodies, of changing lights that blinded them, of the purring and clicking of coiled mechanisms, and the high sibilant voices of their examiners conferring together. It was an ordeal such as no human beings had ever before undergone. Toward the end, through clouds of numbness and confusion, they felt a stinging sensation in their chests, and each realized vaguely that an incision had been made in his flesh with a tiny tusk-like knife, and that suction pumps of the same type as those employed in drawing animal fluids from the caged monsters were being applied to these incisions. Dully and half obliviously they watched the blood that was drawn slowly through thin black elastic tubes into squat-bellied bottles of gill-capacity. Their brains were unable to attach any real meaning to this process, and it would not have occurred to them to resist. They accepted it as part of a senseless and troubleless delirium. Both were on the point of virtual collapse from increasing malaise. They scarcely noticed when the tubes were withdrawn and the filled bottles corked and laid carefully aside. Nor did they perceive the subsequent action of their examiners till there came a sharp prickling in their shoulders. Almost instantly their senses cleared, and they saw that a light green fluid was being injected into their veins by transparent hypodermics, with double needles curved like serpents' teeth. The fluid must have been a powerful drug, for every sign of illness or even nervousness disappeared within a minute or 2 after its administration. Both men felt the same sense of well-being, of mental alertness and physical fitness and buoyancy with which they had awakened from their last period of unconsciousness. They surmised that they were not experiencing the effects of the drug for the first time.
"Well," remarked Roverton, "that dope is what you might call an all-round panacea. I don't feel as if there ever had been, or ever could be, anything the matter with me. The stuff seems to take the place of food, drink, and medicine."
"It's a pretty fair tonic," agreed Volmar, "but watch out for the possible hangover." Now, with returning normality, they observed the vials of drawn blood, and the memory of what had happened came back to them with a new potentiality of significance.
"I hope," said Roverton, "that these people will be satisfied before they reach the dissection stage. Apparently, they mean to learn all they can about us. Do you suppose they are trying to determine our fitness to become citizens of their world?"
"That's not so unlikely. Or perhaps they are trying to find out what use they can make of us, what particular sort of serum or gland extract we might afford. Personally, I have an intuition that there is something pretty horrible behind all this."